The nurse who wheeled Marcus Webb into Bay 7 of Our Lady of the Lake Regional Medical Centre would later say that what struck her first was not his colour, though his lips had gone the grey-blue of a bruise left too long. It was not his stillness, though he was motionless in a way that healthy 24-year-olds simply are not. What struck her was the smell. Something sweet, artificial, grape-adjacent, like a child's candy dissolved in something that had no business being sweet. It came off his clothes, his skin, the creases of his fingers. She had smelled it before, not this strong. The monitor clipped to Marcus's left index finger read 28. 28 beats per minute. A resting adult heart runs between 60 and 100. An athlete's heart at peak conditioning drops to maybe 40 during sleep. 28 is not a number that belongs to a living person going about their afternoon. 28 is a number that belongs to a body in the process of deciding whether to continue. It was a Tuesday, 4:12 p.m. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world connected by a single story. 4 hours earlier, Marcus had been standing in his grandmother's backyard on Scenic Highway, eating from a paper plate piled with potato salad and smoked sausage, laughing at something his cousin had said. The afternoon light was the specific gold of a Louisiana summer that has not yet tipped into its worst heat. He was wearing a white t-shirt. He had a cup in his hand, white styrofoam sweating in the humidity, and anyone who didn't know what was inside it would have assumed it was soda. Nobody at that cookout was alarmed. That's the first thing to understand. The ER physician on duty that afternoon was a man named Dr. Raymond Turow, 51 years old, 17 years in emergency medicine, 12 of them in Baton Rouge. He had seen lean overdoses before. The first wave hit his ER hard around 2012, then again around 2017. Each time the presentation was recognisable. Suppressed breathing, slowed heart rate, a particular kind of unresponsiveness that looked almost peaceful from the outside. He knew what to do. He had done it. But when he looked at Marcus Webb's chart, then looked at Marcus Webb, something made him pause for 3 full seconds before giving the first order. The toxicology wasn't matching. Codeine, the opioid base of lean, should have been the dominant compound. It wasn't. The preliminary screen showed an opioid signature, yes, but not one that mapped cleanly onto anything in the standard panel. Turow had seen dirty positives before, contaminated samples, lab errors. He ordered a second drawer immediately. Then he ordered 2 milligrams of naloxone, Narcan, the overdose reversal drug, administered intravenously. Marcus's heart rate moved, slowly, not the sharp recovery Turow expected. 31 beats per minute. The nurse adjusted the oxygen mask. Someone called for a crash cart to be positioned closer, not deployed, positioned. There is a specific language to emergency rooms, a grammar of proximity and distance, and the grammar in Bay 7 that afternoon was saying something quietly serious. Nobody in that room knew yet what Marcus had actually consumed. Here is what was already known about lean in America before Marcus Webb was loaded into that ambulance, before his grandmother Loretta heard the siren from her kitchen and didn't yet know it was for her grandson, before his 17-year-old brother Trey looked up from his phone and saw the EMTs moving fast across the grass. Lean, also called purple drank, sizzurp, dirty Sprite, had been killing people slowly and publicly for 3 decades. DJ Screw, the Houston producer who essentially invented the genre of slowed-down, sedated hip-hop that became lean's cultural soundtrack, died of a codeine overdose in 2000. Pimp C, one half of the rap duo UGK, died of it in 2007. Lil Wayne was hospitalized for it multiple times between 2012 and 2016, once so severely that his team reportedly began preparing statements. It was everywhere in the music. It was aspirational. A purple cup with a Jolly Rancher dissolving in the bottom of it became, over the course of 20 years, one of the most recognizable symbols in American popular culture. But that's not what was killing Marcus Webb. What was killing Marcus Webb was something newer, something that didn't have a household name yet, something that had entered the lean supply in the previous 18 months through a chain of events that started nowhere near Baton Rouge, involved people Marcus had never met and would never meet, and had been flagged, documented, reported by at least one person who spent months trying to get someone in authority to care. Nobody cared, not in time. Lean-related cardiac events in Louisiana, Mississippi and Alabama had tripled between January 2024 and June 2025, not doubled, tripled. The average age of the patients was dropping, from the late 20s in prior years to a cluster now centred around 22. The cases shared a feature that kept appearing in the paperwork and being noted and then set aside. The standard reversal treatment wasn't working the way it should. Partial responses, slower recoveries, a few cases where the patient was revived but the cardiac damage left behind was permanent. Dr. Turo didn't know these statistics yet. He was watching Marcus Webb's chest rise and fall with the specific shallow irregularity that means the body is no longer managing its own breathing without assistance. 33 beats per minute, moving up slowly. The second naloxone dose went in at 4:21 p.m. Turode stood at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed, watching the monitor, not because there was nothing else to do, but because sometimes that is what medicine looks like from the outside. A person standing very still while their mind runs very fast. Marcus's lips were still grey-blue. His hands, resting at his sides on the white sheet, were the hands of someone who fixed tyres for a living. Wide palms, a scar along the left thumb from a tool that slipped. His chest kept moving. Shallow, but moving. Nobody in Bay 7 yet knew the answer to the question that should have been asked months before Marcus Webb arrived there. Nobody knew what was in the cups that had been circulating through Scotlandville, through the north side, through the gatherings and block parties and late nights where someone always had a connect and the product always looked exactly the same as it always had. Purple, sweet, grape Jolly Rancher, cold. 4 hours earlier, Marcus was laughing at a cookout. What happened in between those 4 hours, and everything that led to them, is a story that did not begin with Marcus, and did not end with his heart rate at 28. It began much earlier, and it is still not over. Marcus Darnell Webb was born on March 3, 2001, at Woman's Hospital on Airline Highway, the first child of Denise Webb, who was 22 years old and working the morning shift at a laundromat on Florida Boulevard. His father's name appears on the birth certificate and nowhere else in this story. By the time Marcus was forming full sentences, it was just Denise, Marcus and Loretta, his grandmother, who owned the small yellow house on Scenic Highway, where 3 generations eventually learned to share a single bathroom without significant incident. Scotlandville sits in the northern part of Baton Rouge, pressed between the Mississippi River to the west and the industrial corridor that runs along Scenic Highway. Refineries, chemical plants, the kind of infrastructure that employs some people in a neighbourhood and poisons the air for everyone. The life expectancy in Scotlandville runs about 11 years shorter than in the wealthy southern suburbs of the same city. Not a different country, the same city. Marcus grew up knowing which streets to walk and which to cross, not because anyone sat him down and explained it, but because that knowledge accumulated the way all essential knowledge does in neighbourhoods like his, through observation, through proximity, through watching what happened to people who didn't pay attention. He was not a remarkable student. Not a poor one. He sat in the middle of his classes at Scotlandville Magnet High School, did enough to pass, and spent his real attention on the things that actually interested him. The engine of his uncle's 1998 Silverado, which he could disassemble and partially reassemble by age 15, and the Amit River, where he fished on Saturday mornings with a rod that had a crack in the handle wrapped in electrical tape that he never got around to replacing. His brother Trey arrived when Marcus was 7. Trey was the kind of child who asked questions about everything. Why the sky was that specific colour at dusk? Why the refineries burned off gas in orange flares at night? Why certain words meant one thing in a song and another thing when adults used them? Marcus answered what he could and made up the rest with such confidence that Trey didn't figure out the difference until he was 11. By then, it had become a game between them. Their mother Denise worked. That is the most accurate and complete description of Denise Webb's life during Marcus's childhood. She worked. 2 shifts at the laundromat became 2 jobs when Marcus was 9. The laundromat in the morning, a hospital cafeteria in the evenings. On the refrigerator she kept a handwritten list of what each week's paycheck needed to cover, in order of priority. The electricity bill was always 3rd on the list. Marcus, from the age of 16, started covering it himself. He got the job at Reliable Tire and Auto on Plank Road 2 weeks after his 17th birthday, walking in without an appointment and telling the owner, a man named Gerald Fontenot, that he could already change a tyre faster than whoever Gerald currently had doing it. Gerald tested this claim. Marcus was right. He was hired at $11 an hour and received 2 raises in the first year. By 22, Marcus was the person everyone at that shop came to when something wasn't running right. He could diagnose an engine problem by sound, not a party trick, a skill, built from years of paying attention to things that most people tuned out. He was good at his job. He was reliable at his job. He showed up at 7:45 a.m. for an 8 a.m. shift and left when the work was done, not when the clock permitted. He was also, in the specific way that matters for this story, a person who had not yet needed anything he couldn't handle on his own. That detail is important. It explains something about what came later. Loretta Webb, 71 years old, had lived in the yellow house on Scenic Highway for 43 years. She grew tomatoes in the side yard that never fully thrived in the Louisiana heat, but that she refused to stop planting. She attended Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church every Sunday and had opinions about the quality of the choir that she did not keep to herself. She watched Marcus and Trey with the particular attention of someone who has seen enough of the world to know which directions the dangers come from. She knew about lean. Not by that name, not initially. She called it that stuff in the cups the first time she saw it at a neighbour's gathering in 2022, because that's what it was. A cup. Purple liquid. Styrofoam. The young men holding them moved through the afternoon with a particular slow ease, like they were watching the world through glass. She filed the observation away without urgency. It didn't seem like her problem yet. Now, the cultural architecture that made lean invisible as a threat, at least to outsiders, at least for a long time. Lean was not invented in a lab or imported from a foreign market. It grew out of Houston's 3rd Ward in the late 1980s, a neighborhood where the distances between everything, joy and grief, legal and illegal, alive and dead, ran extremely short. The original formula was almost incidental. Prescription-strength cough syrup containing codeine and promethazine, mixed with a carbonated soft drink, usually Sprite, sweetened further with hard candy. The codeine was the opioid. The promethazine was an antihistamine and antiemetic, added to the cough syrup originally to prevent nausea, but in high doses it amplifies and extends the sedation, creates a heaviness in the limbs, a slowing of perception that users consistently described as the world going into slow motion. DJ Screw, born Robert Earl Davis Jr. in Bastrop, Louisiana, didn't just use lean, he made it into an aesthetic. His chopped and screwed technique of slowing rap tracks down to half speed and adding repeating loops was a direct sonic translation of the lean experience. Everything stretched, deepened, the world at three-quarter time. The music sounded like the drug felt. That feedback loop, the drug shaping the music, shaping the culture, shaping the drug, was unlike anything that had happened with any substance in American popular culture before it. By the mid-2000s, lean had escaped Houston entirely. 3-6 Mafia was rapping about it from Memphis. Lil Wayne from New Orleans made it the defining substance of his public persona. Purple cup in hand, a specific brand of cough syrup referenced by name in interviews, a casual openness about his consumption that read less as confession and more as lifestyle documentation. To a generation of young men in the South in particular, the cup was not a warning sign. It was a symbol. It meant something about belonging, about a particular kind of ease, about being someone who moved through difficulty without letting it show. That context does not excuse what happened to Marcus Webb. It explains what he was walking into without knowing he was walking into anything. In the summer of 2024, the gas station 2 blocks from Loretta's house on Scenic Highway sold styrofoam cups, 2 for $1, the 32-ounce size. The cup sat on a rack near the register, next to the Jolly Ranchers, next to the single-serve bottles of grape-flavoured soda. This was not a coincidence of retail placement. The owner of that gas station was not complicit in anything. These were just products that sold. Marcus passed that gas station every day on his way to work. He never stopped. Not yet. His best friend since the 4th grade was a man named Devon Arsenault, who had grown up 3 houses down from Loretta's on the same block of Scenic Highway, and who worked, as of the spring of 2024, at a shipping warehouse off Interstate 10. Devon was the kind of person who knew everyone in a 4-block radius by name and had somehow managed to accumulate goodwill with people who actively disliked each other, a social skill so specific and rare that Marcus had spent years observing it without being able to replicate it. They had been inseparable since they were 9 years old, through high school, through the years when Marcus's father's absence clarified itself into permanence, through the specific grinding routine of being young, employed, and working class in a city that offered limited formal pathways between where they were and somewhere else. Trey, 17, as of the spring of 2024, had inherited none of Marcus's mechanical intuition but all of his composure. He sat quietly in rooms and noticed things. He was a junior at Scotlandville Magnet, getting grades Marcus never approached, interested in architecture. He filled the margins of his notebooks with floor plans, building cross-sections, structural sketches that his teachers found surprising for a 17-year-old who had never taken a formal drafting course. He idolized Marcus, not in a stated way, not in a way Marcus would have recognized if someone described it to him, but in the way that matters more. He watched how Marcus handled things and used that as his primary reference for how a person was supposed to move through the world. That detail will matter later. It will matter enormously. In the spring of 2024, before everything shifted, Marcus Webb's life had a structure. Work at 7:45, home by 6, fishing on Saturdays if the weather allowed, Devon on Friday nights, sometimes a gathering, sometimes just the two of them watching a game at Devon's place on the same block where they'd grown up, Loretta's dinner on Sundays, the electricity bill covered, Trey's school fees paid on time. It was not a large life, it was a stable one. The stability was about to become a liability, not because stability is dangerous, but because Marcus Webb had never developed a tool for handling the moment when stability ends. Nobody had ever needed to give him one. He had never, in 23 years, encountered something he couldn't metabolize through routine, through work, through the particular quiet stoicism that had always been sufficient. What was coming was not something that stoicism could metabolize, and somewhere in the supply chain that would eventually reach the cups being passed around Scotlandville, in a facility that had nothing to do with Louisiana, in a warehouse whose address was registered to a company whose name meant nothing to anyone in Baton Rouge, something was being mixed into the purple syrup that no one in Marcus's world knew to look for. It was already there, before Devon got shot, before the first cup, already there, moving toward him through a chain of ordinary transactions, invisible in the colour, undetectable in the taste, waiting in the bottom of a white styrofoam cup 2 blocks from his grandmother's house. The shooting happened on a Wednesday night in June 2024 at the corner of Scenic Highway and East Brookstown Drive, 40 yards from the gas station that sold styrofoam cups 2 for $1. Devon Arsenault was not the intended target. That fact would be established by the Baton Rouge Police Department within 72 hours of the incident, and it would change nothing about what Devon's body looked like when the paramedics arrived, or what Marcus saw when he got to the scene before anyone thought to stop him from getting there. 2 bullets. One caught Devon in the left shoulder and exited cleanly. The other entered through his lower right side and did not exit. That one took 7 hours of surgery at Our Lady of the Lake, the same hospital that would receive Marcus himself 14 months later, and left Devon with a drainage tube in his torso and a surgeon's frank assessment that 2 centimetres in any direction, and the conversation would have been different. Devon survived. Marcus did not sleep for 4 days, not a figure of speech. 4 days, 96 hours during which Marcus worked his shift at Reliable Tire, sat in the hospital waiting room during the surgery, drove Denise to work when her car wouldn't start, sat with Devon's mother at her kitchen table, while she moved between grief and relief without ever landing on either, and returned each night to Loretta's house to lie on his bed with his eyes open, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had been there since a roof leak in 2019, and that nobody had gotten around to painting over. He was not falling apart. That was the problem. He was holding everything together with the same automatic competence that had always worked before, not recognizing that the mechanism was running on empty. On the 4th day after the shooting, Devon was transferred out of the ICU into a regular room. He was awake, medicated, furious in the particular way of a person who is in pain and cannot do anything about the source of it. Marcus visited for 2 hours. He drove home on Scenic Highway, past Loretta's house, kept driving. He didn't know he was going to keep driving until he'd already done it. He ended up at a gathering at Devon's cousin Reginald's house on Blount Road, not because he had been specifically invited, but because he had been generally told the door was open, and because the alternative was another night staring at the ceiling water stain. Reginald's backyard held maybe 15 people, a speaker playing something slow and bass-heavy, the specific atmosphere of a summer night in a Louisiana yard that has been inhabited by the same extended network for years, familiar without being comfortable, easy without being relaxed. Marcus sat in a folding chair by the fence. Someone he didn't know well, a man in his late 20s whose name Marcus would later only remember as starting with a K, sat down in the adjacent chair and set a styrofoam cup on the armrest between them, and then, without ceremony or pressure, set a second cup where Marcus's hand was resting, not handed to him, placed near him. The distinction would seem meaningless to anyone watching. It did not feel meaningless in the moment. Marcus looked at the cup. He knew what was in it. He had been around enough gatherings to recognize the colour, the condensation, the particular density of the liquid. He had never had it before, not because of any principled decision. It had simply never been in his hand. He picked it up. Now, to understand what happened next in Marcus's body, The chemistry has to be explained without the fog that usually surrounds it. Codeine is an opioid. It exists in prescription-strength cough syrup, the kind that requires a doctor's signature to obtain, because it is effective at suppressing the cough reflex. When a person swallows codeine, the liver converts a portion of it into morphine. That morphine crosses into the brain and binds to opioid receptors, the same receptors that regulate pain, breathing, and the body's entire reward system. The effect is sedation, warmth, the specific dissolution of anxiety that feels less like being drugged and more like being released from something you didn't realize you were carrying. Promethazine, the second active ingredient in lean's traditional formula, is an antihistamine used to treat nausea and allergic reactions. In prescribed doses, it is unremarkable. Combined with codeine in the concentrations found in lean, it extends and deepens the sedation, slows the body systems further, creates a heaviness in the limbs that users consistently describe not as impairment but as arrival, as if the ordinary state of being tense and alert were the aberration, and this were the baseline. The margin between a lean high and a lean overdose is not wide. It was never wide. What makes it particularly dangerous is that the drug suppresses the brain's CO2 sensitivity, the alarm system that wakes a sleeping person when their breathing has slowed too much. A person on lean does not feel themselves stop breathing. They feel comfortable. Marcus felt the first sip move through him like a pressure releasing. He had not slept in 4 days. His best friend had come within 2 centimeters of dying. The job, the electricity bill, Denise's car, Devon's mother at her kitchen table, all of it had been held in place through a constant low-grade muscular effort that Marcus had not named as effort because he had never known it as anything else. The lean did not add anything to him. It removed the weight he'd been carrying so continuously that he had stopped registering it as weight. He sat in the folding chair in Reginald's backyard. The music from the speaker moved at the same slow frequency as everything else. The June heat, which had been aggressive 20 minutes earlier, settled into something merely warm. He didn't think about Devon. He didn't think about anything. His hands, which had not been entirely still in 4 days, went still. He stayed for 3 hours. He drove home at midnight with the kind of clarity that arrives after the body has finally been permitted to rest. Not the lean itself, which was wearing off, but the backwash of relief. He slept 7 hours without interruption. The water stain on the ceiling was still there in the morning, unchanged. He thought nothing more about the cup. This is what makes the inciting incident of nearly every lean story structurally identical and structurally devastating. The first time is not dramatic. There is no visible threshold being crossed. The person does not feel themselves make a decision, because it doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like a night that worked out better than the night before it. The drug's pharmacology is specifically designed, by evolutionary accident rather than malicious intent, to feel like a solution rather than a problem. The second time Marcus had a cup was 11 days later, at another gathering, different house, same north side. He accepted it more easily. Why wouldn't he? It had helped before. The third time was 9 days after that. He sorted out. That progression, 11 days, 9 days, sort, is not a moral failure. It is a pharmacological timetable. Opioid tolerance builds faster than almost any other class of drug. The brain, flooded with artificial opioid signals, begins reducing its own production of natural endorphins. Within weeks, the baseline emotional state starts to shift downward, not dramatically, not noticeably at first, but measurably. The lean is no longer returning a person to neutral. It is correcting a deficit that the lean itself created. Marcus did not know this. Nobody had told him. Nobody was telling the people around him either. Devon, out of the hospital by mid-July and moving carefully, with a tightness in his right side that would persist for the rest of the year, began having a cup at gatherings too. He and Marcus never discussed it as a thing they were doing. It was present, then it was routine, then it was just what the evenings looked like. By September 2024, 3 months after Marcus's first cup at Reginald's yard, both men were sourcing it directly rather than waiting for gatherings. Devon knew a man who knew the Connect. The Connect was reliable, the product was consistent, the price was $20 for a 2-ounce pour that was enough for one evening. $20. The electricity bill was covered. Marcus was still showing up to work on time. Devon was still at the warehouse. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside the cups, something already had. Not in the ones Marcus and Devon were drinking yet. Not quite yet. But in the supply chain above them, in the inventory that was slowly moving south and east toward Louisiana, through a distribution network whose upper levels none of them would ever see or know about, the formula had already been altered. The prescription codeine syrup was becoming harder to source. The DEA had tightened controls on hydrocodone and codeine dispensing in 2023, a regulatory response to the broader opioid crisis that succeeded in reducing legitimate prescriptions and simultaneously created a gap in the black market that someone somewhere had decided to fill. The replacement product looked identical, same purple colour, achieved with food dye, same viscosity. The grape Jolly Rancher dissolved in it the same way. It tasted close enough that someone who had not been drinking lean for years might not notice the difference. Someone who had been drinking it for years might notice something slightly off, something stronger, something that hit a little faster, and interpret that as a good batch. Marcus and Devon were not drinking it yet. The question was not whether they would. The question was when. By October 2024, the cup had a place in Marcus's day, the way coffee has a place in other people's mornings, not yet desperate, not yet the first thought upon waking, but present as an expectation. After work, before the evening settled, the specific sequence never varied. The styrofoam cup from the gas station 2 blocks over, the grape Jolly Rancher from the same rack he passed every morning, the pour measured not by any instrument, but by the weight of the day behind him. He kept the syrup in a paper bag in the back of his closet. Not hidden, exactly. Just not displayed. The ritual had texture to it. That matters, because rituals with texture are harder to interrupt than habits without them. Marcus would shower first. The tire shop left a particular grease smell that settled into the skin, then change into the soft basketball shorts he'd owned since community college, then pour. Always in that order. The sequence itself was part of the relief, a set of gates that the body learned to pass through in anticipation of what came at the end. By the time the Jolly Rancher hit the bottom of the cup, his shoulders had already begun to drop. The music was deliberate, slowed and reverbed tracks. The DJ Screw tradition extended across 3 decades into a current generation of producers who'd refine the technique into something both more polished and more melancholy. At half speed, a song about ordinary things becomes something else entirely. The bass frequencies drop into a range the body feels before the ears register it. Time stops moving at its regular pace. For Marcus, who spent 8 hours a day in a shop where urgency was the baseline condition, a car waiting, a customer impatient, a deadline measured in minutes, the altered tempo of the music was not an aesthetic preference. It was a physiological necessity. He sat, usually on the edge of his bed, sometimes in the single chair by the window that looked out over Loretta's side yard, where the tomatoes were browning at the edges in the October heat. He didn't watch his phone, he didn't watch television, he just sat with the cup and let the music run and let the codeine do what codeine does. This is what the high actually felt like, described without the distortion that comes from either romanticizing or condemning it. The first 20 minutes, a warmth beginning in the chest, not painful, not even particularly notable. just a slight raising of the ambient temperature of the body, accompanied by a loosening in the jaw and the base of the skull. The specific knot that Marcus carried between his shoulder blades from hunching over wheel wells all day dissolved in a way that stretching never fully achieved. His vision didn't blur. His thinking didn't slow. Not yet. He was simply less opposed to things. By 40 minutes, the promethazine component was doing its work. The sedation deepened without becoming sleep. This is the pharmacological seam that lean exploits, the zone between wakefulness and unconsciousness, where the body is fully present, but the mind has relinquished its grip on urgency. Users almost universally describe it as the world becoming optional. Not gone, just optional. The Jolly Rancher dissolved completely by the time the cup was half finished, leaving a residue of artificial grape sweetness at the bottom that had become, for Marcus, so associated with the relief that followed that the smell alone, grape candy, anywhere, in any context, began triggering a low anticipatory response in his brain. That response has a name. It is called a conditioned cue. It is the same mechanism, structurally identical, that makes a recovering alcoholic's hands sweat when they walk past a bar. The brain does not distinguish between the substance and the signals surrounding the substance. It learns the entire package. Marcus didn't know this. He was not thinking about pharmacology. He was sitting by the window watching Loretta's half-dead tomatoes go orange in the late afternoon light, and for the first time since Devon got shot 4 months earlier, he felt something that resembled peace. Now, the social dimension. Because lean was never just a private experience. The cup was a social object in Scotlandville the way cigarettes were once a social object in other contexts. Something passed, shared, offered as hospitality, used to mark time together. At gatherings on the north side in late 2024, the cups were present the way bottles of beer are present at a backyard barbecue. Unremarkable in their frequency, ambient in their availability, carrying a social grammar that was legible to everyone in the room without being spoken. Accepting a cup from someone was an act of trust. Having a cup to offer signalled a kind of standing. Marcus was not isolated in his use. He was embedded in it. Devon, recovered enough by October to move without wincing, had developed his own version of the ritual, though Devon's was louder, more social, less solitary. Devon drank with other people. He was the type whose personality expanded in company, who needed an audience to fully inhabit himself, and the lean gave his natural sociability an additional loosening that he described to Marcus, in the indirect way men in their mid-20s describe vulnerability, as finally being able to turn the volume down on everything that wasn't the room he was in. That description, the volume down, recurs in interviews with lean users across demographic lines, geographic lines, income lines. It is not unique to Devon. It is, in fact, the most consistent description offered by people who use lean heavily. Not that it creates something, but that it removes something. The specific something it removes is the low-frequency anxiety of a life in which the ground never feels entirely solid. In Scotlandville in late 2024, the ground had not felt solid for a long time. Now the second storyline, running parallel to Marcus's evenings, 3 miles away at LSU Health Sciences Center on Florida Boulevard, inside a building whose parking lot was perpetually full and whose vending machines on the 3rd floor had been broken since February. Doctor. Felicia Okafor was 38 years old, a pharmacist by original training who had spent the last 6 years in addiction research after watching, during her residency at University Medical Center in New Orleans, a pattern she could not explain using the framework she had been given. Patients presenting with opioid overdoses who had received adequate naloxone doses and were not recovering on the expected timeline. The overdoses looked like codeine. The recovery looked like something else. She had filed the observation away in 2019, during a period when the opioid crisis narrative was so thoroughly dominated by the fentanyl in heroin story that a pharmacist in Louisiana noting an anomaly in lean overdose presentations had no obvious institutional home for the concern. She moved into research. She began building a database. By early 2025, that database contained 340 cases from Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, spanning the period from January 2022 to December 2024. The cases were sourced from ER admission records, toxicology reports, and medical examiner files. The unsexy, unglamorous data work that generates no headlines and receives no funding from sources interested in headlines. The pattern Dr. Okafor was seeing in that data was specific. In overdose cases involving lean, the ratio between the reported amount consumed and the severity of the physiological response had been shifting. Not dramatically in 2022, not even notably in 2023. But across 2024, the curve bent. Cases where a moderate amount of lean produced a severe overdose response. Cases where the naloxone reversal was partial rather than complete. Cases where the cardiac aftermath was disproportionate to what codeine alone should be capable of producing at the documented dose. She was not, at this stage, certain what the cause was. She had a hypothesis. The hypothesis required a physical sample to test. She submitted a formal request to the Louisiana Department of Health in November 2024, asking for access to confiscated street lean samples for laboratory analysis. The request was acknowledged. It was assigned a case number. It entered the queue of requests that the department received and processed in the order of priority that bureaucratic systems assign to things, which is to say, it waited. Dr. Okafor waited with it. She was used to waiting. She kept building her database. What she did not yet know, what no one in any official capacity yet knew, was that the contamination she suspected was already well established in the supply chain. Not a new development, not an experiment. A settled practice, generating revenue, operating with the confidence of something that had not yet been caught. Marcus, meanwhile, had started buying more than he needed for a single evening. The shift was subtle enough that he registered it first as practicality. It was more efficient to have a supply than to arrange a purchase every few days. The logic was sound, and the logic was also structurally a rationalization, though the distinction between efficiency and rationalization is not always visible from the inside. He kept the paper bag in the back of the closet. Then he moved it to the shelf because reaching to the back was inconvenient. The Jolly Ranchers moved to his nightstand. Devon started coming over on Tuesday nights, which had previously been a night when Marcus stayed home alone. Not because Tuesday had any particular social significance. It was simply the night Devon's warehouse ran a double shift that ended at 4, leaving an evening with nothing already scheduled. They sat in Marcus's room, or on Loretta's back porch, cups in hand, music running, and talked about nothing with the specific ease of two people who'd been friends long enough that silence between them had no weight. Trey, doing homework at the kitchen table on these Tuesday nights, could hear the music through the wall. Slowed down, bass heavy, the specific register of it distinct from anything he would have chosen. He did not think much about it yet. His brother had Devon over. They listened to music. This had always been true in some form. One Tuesday in early November, Trey walked past Marcus's closed door on the way to the bathroom and noticed the grape smell even through the wood. He paused, kept walking. He did not know what it meant, but he stored it, the way he stored everything, without yet knowing what shelf to put it on. The following week, Marcus called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. He wasn't sick. He was exhausted in a way that sleep was no longer fixing, though he would not have described it in those terms. he would have said he needed a day. Gerald Fontenot, who had employed Marcus for 6 years and trusted him implicitly, accepted this without question. Marcus spent the day at home. He had his cup earlier than usual, mid-afternoon, not evening. He told himself it was just that one day. Somewhere in a laboratory 3 miles away, Dr. Felicia Okafor was looking at a fresh cluster of data points from December 2024 that were doing something new. 3 cases, all from the North Baton Rouge corridor, all presenting within a 10-day window, all showing the same partial naloxone response she'd been tracking. But these 3 were different in one specific way that made her sit very still at her desk for a moment before she started typing. All 3 patients had been under 25. None of them had been using lean for more than 8 months. The timeline was accelerating. Whatever was happening in the supply was not staying stable. It was moving faster, hitting harder, finding younger users. She began drafting a preliminary findings memo that evening, working past 9 p.m. in a building that had emptied around her, the broken vending machine humming uselessly at the end of the hall. She would submit that memo in January 2025. What would happen to it after that is a question that should keep anyone who reads it awake for at least one night. The bathroom floor was cold. That was the first thing Marcus registered. Not confusion, not alarm, just the specific chill of tile against his cheek on a February morning, the grout line pressing a faint ridge into his skin. He didn't know how he had gotten there. The last thing he remembered was sitting on the edge of his bed at around 10:30 the previous night, cup in hand, music running low. The bathroom was 8 feet from his bedroom door. He had no memory of standing up, walking those 8 feet, or lying down. He was simply there, on the floor, with the February light coming flat and grey through the frosted window above the toilet, and his left arm was asleep from the shoulder, down from being pinned beneath him. He got up, checked the time, 6:14 a.m. He had to be at work at 7:45. Loretta was already in the kitchen. She had found him 20 minutes earlier when she got up for her morning glass of water, and noticed the bathroom door ajar, and Marcus's feet visible through the gap. She'd stood in the doorway for 30 seconds, long enough to confirm he was breathing, long enough to watch his chest rise and fall twice, before going to the kitchen to start the coffee. She did not wake him. She did not call anyone. When Marcus came into the kitchen at 6:20, Loretta was at the stove with her back to him. She did not turn around. He told her he had slipped getting up in the night, disoriented in the dark. She nodded once, still facing the stove, and asked if he wanted eggs. She knew. The eggs were her way of not saying what she knew. Marcus ate the eggs and drove to work and spent the morning doing alignments and rotating tyres with the specific focused competence that had always been his default mode under stress. His left arm regained full feeling by 9 a.m. By noon, he had processed the morning sufficiently to file it under an explanation he could live with. He had been tired. He had overslept in an inconvenient location. It wouldn't happen again. His hands were steady. That was true. What was also true, though Marcus could not have quantified it, the cup that night had not been a choice in the way the first cup at Reginald's yard had been a choice. It had been a correction. His body, by February 2025, had recalibrated its chemistry around the presence of codeine with the thoroughness of a system that no longer remembered operating differently. The shaking was not yet visible in the morning, but there was a quality to the first hour of every day, a low electrical hum in the muscles, a slight thinning of the air, that was only fully resolved once the evening arrived. He had not named this. Naming it would have required acknowledging a category he was not ready to inhabit. Devon, 3 blocks away, was having his own version of the same experience and describing it in different terms. He told Marcus the following Tuesday, as they sat on Loretta's back porch with their cups, that he had been having weird dreams. This was Devon's language for the nodding episodes, the sudden drops into a semi-conscious state that could last anywhere from 20 minutes to 3 hours, during which the body continued to breathe and the eyes sometimes stayed partially open, but the person inside was essentially absent. Nodding is what happens when the opioid sedation tips past a certain threshold. It is not sleep. The EEG profile is different. It is a state of suspended animation that looks peaceful from outside and is experienced when the person surfaces from it as an unexplained gap in time. Devon described waking from these episodes with the mild disorientation of a long afternoon nap, nothing more alarming. Marcus laughed. Devon laughed. They both understood, on some level, what was happening. Neither of them used the word overdose, because it didn't feel like overdosing, it felt like the drug working. The distinction between those two things in the context of opioid pharmacology is narrower than either of them knew. 3 miles away, on a Thursday morning in late January 2025, Dr. Felicia Okafor had submitted her preliminary findings memo to the Louisiana Department of Health. The document was 11 pages, single-spaced, with 47 cited sources and 3 data visualizations showing the anomalous recovery curve in opioid overdose cases she'd been tracking for 3 years. It was titled, in the dry language of public health documentation, Atypical Naloxone Response in Presumed Codeine-Based Opioid Overdoses, a regional case series with preliminary etiological hypothesis. The hypothesis, stated plainly on page 2, the lean supply in the North Louisiana corridor contained an adulterant, possibly a fentanyl analogue, possibly something newer. The data was not yet sufficient to identify the compound. She needed physical samples, but the behavioral signature in the overdose cases was consistent with an opioid more potent and pharmacologically distinct from codeine. The memo was received on January 23, 2025. It was assigned case reference number LDH-202-5-00441. A response acknowledging receipt was generated automatically by the department's intake system and sent to Dr. Okafor's institutional email address at 11:47 a.m. on the same day. That was the last communication she received about it for 9 weeks. 9 weeks during which the data points in her database kept accumulating. 9 weeks during which the North Baton Rouge corridor continued receiving shipments of a product that looked like lean, tasted like lean, and was doing something to people's hearts that codeine alone had never done with this consistency. Marcus called in sick a second time in February, then a third time in early March. Gerald Fontenot did not fire him after the third absence. He had employed Marcus for 6 years and trusted the track record over the recent pattern. But he pulled Marcus aside in the parking lot after the third return and told him, in the plain-spoken way of a man who had run a small business for 20 years, that he needed to know if there was something going on. Marcus told him no. Everything was fine. He appreciated Gerald's concern. He drove home and had his cup before dinner for the first time. The shift from evening to pre-dinner was not dramatic. Hours are arbitrary markers. But the cup at 5 p.m. instead of 8 p.m. represented a compression of the interval between doses that the body had quietly been requesting for weeks. The interval between need and fulfillment had been shrinking by small increments since November, each increment too minor to register as significant on its own, the cumulative movement visible only from a distance that Marcus, by definition, could not achieve. Loretta noticed the new timing. She kept her own schedule of observation, silent and meticulous. The paper bag had moved from the closet to the shelf in September. The Jolly Ranchers had been on the nightstand since October, the bathroom floor in February, the pre-dinner cup in March. She was constructing a timeline without knowing what she would do with it. On a Sunday in mid-March, after church, Loretta set Marcus's portion of dinner on the table and sat across from him and looked at his hands while he ate. They were steady. She looked at his eyes, the slight glassiness that appeared about 40 minutes after the cup and lasted 2 hours. She had seen that particular quality before, in a different decade, in a different person in this household, and she associated it with a set of outcomes she did not want associated with her grandson. She did not say anything that Sunday. She moved the Jolly Ranchers from Marcus's nightstand to the kitchen cabinet where she kept them. Marcus found them there the next morning. He moved them back to his nightstand without comment. Loretta found them on the nightstand that afternoon and returned them to the kitchen cabinet. This silent negotiation continued for 6 days without either of them acknowledging it was happening. On the 7th day, Marcus bought a new bag of Jolly Ranchers and kept them at work. Devon, meanwhile, was experiencing something new. On a Tuesday night in late March, he was at a friend's house across the neighbourhood, not with Marcus, a different gathering, when he had an episode that was longer and deeper than the nodding he had been describing as weird dreams. He surfaced from it 2.5 hours after it began with a headache concentrated behind his left eye and a tingling in his left hand that took 20 minutes to fully resolve. He told the person next to him he had just fallen asleep. He believed this. The tingling in his left hand was not sleep. Prolonged oxygen reduction to the brain during a deep nodding episode can produce exactly that neurological signature, a brief, recoverable deficit that resolves when normal circulation resumes. The body keeps score in ways the mind rationalizes away. Devon did not go to the hospital. He drove himself home and ate a bag of chips and went to bed and woke up feeling fine. Across town, Dr. Okafor had finally received a response to her January memo, a letter dated March 29th, 2025, on Louisiana Department of Health letterhead, informing her that her findings had been reviewed and were being considered in the context of the department's current surveillance priorities. The letter thanked her for her contribution to public health documentation in the state of Louisiana. It contained no action items, no timeline, no request for the sample analysis she had specifically proposed. She read the letter twice. Then she picked up her phone and called a contact at a private analytical laboratory in Houston, a former colleague from her residency who now ran toxicology testing for a network of addiction treatment facilities. She asked if the lab could analyze a physical sample of confiscated street lean if she obtained one through independent channels. The answer was yes. The cost was $340 per sample. She started making calls to find someone who could get her a sample. What she did not know, what the Louisiana Department of Health did not know, what no federal agency had yet formally documented, was that the product circulating in North Baton Rouge had already moved to a new supplier. Devon's original connect had gone quiet in early March. Supply dried up without explanation, and Devon had found a replacement through a man 3 degrees of social separation from where they started. The replacement was a man known on the north side by a single name, Source. Marcus tried Source's product for the first time on a Friday night in early April. He noticed it hit faster. He told Devon it was a strong batch. Devon agreed. They finished their cups. Neither of them connected the faster hit to anything that required attention. A strong batch meant the connect was reliable. That was all. In the morning, Marcus's hands were shaking before the coffee was ready. Not dramatically. A fine tremor. The kind that would be invisible to someone standing across a room. Visible only if you held your own hands in front of your face and watched them with the specific focused attention that Marcus did not yet bring to the observation. He noticed it for 2 seconds. Then the coffee was ready and he poured a cup and the tremor settled and he went to work. The contaminated supply was now in their hands, in their cups, in their bloodstreams. They were drinking it every Friday, then every other day, then most days. And somewhere in the chain between Source and the laboratory, that had produced what Source was selling, a compound existed that Dr. Rockefeller had not yet identified, that the DEA had not yet catalogued, and that the standard dose of naloxone sitting in the emergency kits of every first responder in Baton Rouge had never been specifically tested against. The question was not academic anymore. The question had Marcus Webb's name on it. April became May. May became June. The interval between each cup compressed further until the word interval stopped being accurate. There was no longer a meaningful gap between doses, only the practical constraint of the workday, which Marcus was increasingly treating as an obstacle rather than a structure. He lost the job at Reliable Tire on a Thursday in late May. Not fired outright. Gerald Fontenot was not a man who fired people outright after 6 years. What happened was a conversation in the parking lot that covered 4 no-call no-shows across April and May, 2 complaints from customers about work done incorrectly, and one afternoon when a regular client had found Marcus sitting on an overturned bucket behind the shop, eyes half closed, a styrofoam cup balanced on his knee. Gerald said he needed to let Marcus go until Marcus got himself sorted out. He left the door open for return. He meant it. Marcus drove home. He did not tell Denise. He did not tell Loretta. He told Devon that Tuesday, and Devon absorbed the information without the alarm that might have been useful. Not because Devon didn't understand the significance, but because Devon's own relationship to urgency had been progressively softened by the same compound moving through the same cups. They sat on Loretta's back porch and Devon said Marcus would land somewhere else, something better. The tire shop wasn't the ceiling. This was supportive. It was also a way of not engaging with what was actually happening. Marcus started sleeping until 10 a.m., then 11. The morning tremor, which had been mild in April, now lasted until the first cup of the day, which began arriving earlier each week, creeping from late afternoon toward early afternoon toward noon, a slow migration with no single dramatic step, just the daily arithmetic of need. The electricity bill was still being paid. He had savings, not much, but some. The savings would last 3 months at current spend. Marcus knew this, in the back of his mind, with the specific quality of knowledge that a person possesses but does not act on, because acting on it would require confronting a set of connected facts, and the connected facts taken together formed a picture he was not ready to look at directly. Trey knew something was wrong before the job loss, and knew it more concretely after, not because anyone told him, but because Marcus was now home when Trey left for school in the morning, and home when Trey returned in the afternoon, and the rhythm of the house had changed in a way that didn't require explanation. One night in late May, Trey followed Marcus. Not far, not across the city, not to any dramatic location. Marcus walked the 2 blocks to the gas station, bought a styrofoam cup and a grape Jolly Rancher, and came back. Trey stood in the shadow of the neighbour's oak tree and watched his brother's hands during the transaction, the unhurried, practised way Marcus pulled the Jolly Rancher from the rack, the way the gas station clerk didn't make eye contact. Routine, established. The clerk knew the order before Marcus said it. Trey walked home ahead of Marcus and was in his room with the door closed when Marcus came in. He said nothing to Denise. He sat with what he knew the way he sat with everything, quietly, adding it to the accumulating archive of observations that had no clear destination yet. Now, the supply chain. Because what was moving through Marcus's cups by June 2025 requires a precise account. When the DEA tightened federal controls on codeine dispensing in 2023, it accomplished what all supply-side drug enforcement accomplishes with some consistency. It reduced the legitimate product available, while simultaneously creating a profitable gap for whoever had the infrastructure to fill it. The prescription codeine promethazine syrup that had been the base ingredient of lean for 3 decades became significantly harder and more expensive to source on the black market. A 4-ounce bottle that had sold for $40 in 2019 was moving for over $100 by early 2024. Into that gap came counterfeit lean syrup, not an improvised product, not a street corner experiment, a manufactured item produced with industrial consistency, packaged in bottles designed to be visually indistinguishable from legitimate pharmaceutical packaging. Same label layout, same purple colour achieved with FD and C-Red 40, and Blue 1 food dye in a ratio that matched the original precisely. The viscosity was engineered to match. The taste was engineered to match. Someone with access to both the legitimate product and the counterfeit could, in a blind test, identify a difference only by the effect. And the effect was something most users initially interpreted as quality rather than danger. The active opioid in the counterfeit syrup was not codeine. It was a fentanyl analogue, a synthetic compound built on the same molecular scaffold as fentanyl, but with a modified side chain that placed it, as of the spring of 2025, outside the specific chemical definitions used by the DEA's controlled substance scheduling. Not yet scheduled, not yet illegal under the specific statutory language in the federal code. Present in the supply chain, moving freely, doing what fentanyl analogues do to bodies that are expecting codeine. Fentanyl is roughly 100 times more potent than morphine by weight. The analogue in Source's supply was estimated in later laboratory analysis at between 80 and 150 times morphine's potency, the variance itself being the problem, because the batch-to-batch consistency of a product manufactured without pharmaceutical quality controls is not consistency at all. It is a range, and the difference between the low end and the high end of that range in a substance measured in micrograms is the difference between a heavy high and a stopped heart. Source did not manufacture this product. He received it, diluted it to a sellable concentration, and distributed it through a network of street-level exchanges that functioned exactly like any other local drug trade. He had been doing it since January 2025. He had not, to his knowledge, killed anyone yet. That qualifier, yet, was doing significant structural work by June. Dr. Okafor received her physical sample in late April through a contact who worked in harm reduction outreach across North Baton Rouge, a woman named Tamara who distributed fentanyl test strips and clean supplies out of a converted minivan on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Tamara had confiscated a bottle from a client who had consented to its use for testing, and she drove it to LSU Health Sciences in a sealed evidence bag with a chain of custody document that Okafor had helped her draft over the phone. The sample went to Houston on May 2nd. The results came back on May 19th. Dr. Okafor was at her desk when the email arrived. She opened the attached report, read the first page, and then read it again. Then she closed her office door, which she rarely did, and sat at her desk for 11 minutes without touching her keyboard. The Houston lab had confirmed the presence of a fentanyl analogue. The compound was identified by its molecular structure, a specific variant that had appeared in DEA forensic reports from the Pacific Northwest in late 2023, but had not been previously documented in Gulf Coast lean samples. The concentration in the sample was 340% higher than a lethal dose of pharmaceutical fentanyl by weight. But that was not what had made her close the door. The second page of the report contained the reversal pharmacology assessment. Based on the compound's receptor binding profile, the Houston lab's toxicologist had flagged a specific concern. This analogue bound to opioid receptors with an affinity and duration that exceeded standard naloxone's displacement capacity at typical emergency dosing levels. A 2 mg IV dose of naloxone, the standard first response to an opioid overdose, would produce a partial reversal, enough to prevent immediate death, possibly. Not enough for full recovery in many cases. A higher dose or repeat dosing would be required, and the window for effective intervention was shorter than with codeine overdose by approximately 40%. Every first responder in Baton Rouge was carrying naloxone calibrated for a different drug. She called the Louisiana Department of Health that afternoon. She was told her case file was under review. She asked to speak to someone in the overdose surveillance division. She was transferred twice and reached a voicemail. She left a detailed message. She sent an email to the same division with the Houston lab report attached. She did not receive a call back that week. Devon Arsenault had his first seizure on a Saturday afternoon in early June, alone in his apartment on Scenic Highway, while he was watching television. It lasted approximately 90 seconds. He came out of it on his back on the living room floor, disoriented with a bitten tongue and no memory of falling. His first coherent thought was that he had fainted. His second was to check his cup, which had fallen with him and emptied itself across the carpet. He did not call 911. He sat up slowly, felt his tongue with his finger, decided it wasn't serious, and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. Later he told himself it was dehydration. The temperature had been over 95 degrees all week. It was a reasonable explanation for someone who wanted a reasonable explanation. He told Marcus about it the following Tuesday, framing it as a weird thing that had happened, something probably not worth thinking about. Marcus agreed it was probably not worth thinking about. They moved on. Trey, sitting at the kitchen table 10 feet away with his homework, heard Devon say the word seizure, and heard Marcus's response and wrote nothing in his notebook for the next 4 minutes. By the end of June, Marcus was sourcing directly from source. Devon's introduction, a brief exchange in a parking lot off Thomas Road, a price negotiated at $30 for a 4-ounce pour, lower than what Devon paid because Marcus became a regular immediately. He was buying 3 times a week, then 4. His savings account, which had held $1,400 in April, was at $340 in June. The electricity bill was due in 11 days. Denise found out about the job loss at the end of June, not from Marcus but from Gerald Fontenot, who ran into her at the hospital cafeteria where she still worked evenings and asked with genuine concern how Marcus was getting on. Denise drove home from her shift at 11 p.m., sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes in the dark, and then went to bed without waking anyone. In the morning, she made breakfast for Trey and said nothing about it. She added the electricity bill to the handwritten list on the refrigerator. She moved it from 3rd position to 1st. The bill got paid. Marcus didn't know Denise had covered it until he saw it crossed off the list in her handwriting. He stood in front of the refrigerator and looked at it for a long moment. He went to his room. He poured a cup earlier than noon for the first time. The following week, Dr. Okafor received a response from the Louisiana Department of Health regarding her May email with the Houston lab report attached. The response noted that her findings were being forwarded to the State Substance Use Disorder Advisory Committee for consideration at their next quarterly meeting. The next quarterly meeting was scheduled for September 2025. It was currently June. Somewhere between that email and that meeting, in the specific gap of 3 months that institutional process had decided was acceptable, Source's product was moving through North Baton Rouge with the invisible efficiency of something that had never been interrupted. 3 times a week becoming 4. 4 becoming daily. The batch variance running its silent lottery with every cup. Most of the time the low end of the range, tolerable, heavy but survivable. Occasionally the high end. The high-end cups were the ones that produced the nodding Devon described as weird dreams. The floor Marcus woke up on. The seizure Devon attributed to summer heat. And the 4th of July weekend was coming. Marcus had already promised Loretta he would be at the cookout. Dr. Felicia Okafor drove to Houston herself on the last Friday of June 2025. Not for the lab results. She already had those. She drove 4 hours on E10 with the windows down and the AC running simultaneously, a habit from years of long drives, and arrived at the private toxicology facility on the southwest side of the city at 2 p.m. to sit across a desk from the man who had signed the bottom of her lab report. His name was Doctor. Kwame Asante, 54 years old, with a background in forensic pharmacology and a specific expertise in synthetic opioid identification that had made him the person defense attorneys and prosecutors in 4 states called when they needed someone to explain a molecule to a jury. She needed him to explain something different. Not the molecule itself. She understood the molecule. She needed him to explain the reversal problem in terms that a Louisiana Department of Health official sitting in a quarterly meeting in September would not be able to set aside. Asante pulled up the compound's receptor binding data on his screen. He walked her through it for 40 minutes with the patience of someone who had explained complex pharmacology to non-specialists many times and had learned that the only way to make it land was to use the same analogy from 3 different angles until the person's face changed. The face change moment arrived when he explained the binding duration. Standard naloxone works by displacing opioid molecules from their receptors, essentially ejecting the drug from the lock it has occupied, restoring normal receptor function, reversing the overdose. The displacement works because naloxone binds to those receptors more aggressively than most opioids. Codeine, heroin, standard fentanyl, naloxone outcompetes all of them reliably, which is why it has saved hundreds of thousands of lives since its introduction. This analogue was different, not because naloxone couldn't bind, it could, but the analogue's molecular structure gave it a rebinding speed that standard naloxone doses could not keep pace with. Within 7 to 12 minutes of a 2 mg naloxone dose, the analogue began reasserting itself. The overdose didn't reverse, it paused. A paused overdose looks like a reversal from the outside. The paramedic sees the patient respond. The heart rate climbs, breathing improves, the patient may even become partially conscious. In a busy ER with multiple cases and standard protocols, the presentation in the next 20 minutes looks like stabilization. The standard chart entry would read, responded to naloxone, monitoring. The crisis appears resolved. Then the analogue reasserts. The heart rate drops again. The breathing shallows. If the patient is not being monitored continuously, if the second decline is attributed to something else, if the protocol doesn't include a repeat naloxone dose at the 7-minute mark, the window closes. Okafor sat with that for a moment. Every first responder protocol she knew called for naloxone, then monitoring, then a second dose only if the patient failed to respond to the first. The protocol assumed the first dose either worked or didn't, not that it worked, and then stopped working 7 minutes later while the chart said stable. The protocol was designed for a different drug. The drug in the cups had changed. The protocol hadn't. She drove back to Baton Rouge that evening with a new document taking shape in her head. Not a memo this time, something more direct, addressed specifically to ER medical directors rather than the Department of Health, carrying Asante's name and credentials alongside her own. She would send it Monday. She would call the recipients Tuesday to confirm receipt. She would not wait for quarterly meetings. She arrived home at 11 p.m. She made coffee. She started writing. Now the second twist, and it is the one that reframes not just the supply chain, but the entire premise of what had been happening in North Baton Rouge since January. Source's real name was Terence Lyle Mouton, 31 years old, from Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, a man who'd been dealing various substances in the Baton Rouge corridor since he was 23, and who had, by his own operational logic, always maintained a specific standard. He sold what worked, he didn't cut product to the point of danger, and he stayed below the threshold of attention that brought federal involvement. These were not moral principles, They were business principles. Dead customers were bad for business. Mouton had switched to the counterfeit syrup in January 2025 because his existing supplier had gone silent and a new connection had offered him product at half the price with a reliability guarantee. The new connection was not a person Mouton had met in person. The transaction was conducted through an encrypted messaging platform, payment in cryptocurrency, product delivered in cases of what appeared to be legitimately labelled pharmaceutical cough syrup, shipped through a freight forwarding service registered in Nevada. The Nevada company was not a drug operation. It was a legitimate freight forwarder whose services had been contracted by a company registered in Wyoming, a state whose LLC registration requirements, as of 2025, remained among the most permissive in the country. No requirement to disclose ownership, no physical office requirement, a registration fee of $102. The Wyoming company's listed business was nutritional supplement distribution. Mouton had never heard of the Wyoming company. He knew only the encrypted contact, the crypto wallet, the delivery schedule. He was, in the architecture of the operation, a terminal node, the last human in a chain whose earlier links existed entirely in corporate registrations, forwarding addresses, and digital transaction records. The operation was not local. It had never been local. The counterfeit lean was being produced in a facility whose location would not be identified until 8 months after Devon Arsenault died, and even then the identification came not from law enforcement's investigation of the drug itself, but from a financial audit triggered by an unrelated tax complaint. The facility was in a commercial district in a mid-sized city in the American Southwest, registered as a cosmetics and personal care products manufacturer, operating during normal business hours, employing 16 people who believed, or claimed to believe, they were producing a proprietary herbal supplement line. This is the part the viewer needs to sit with. The purple syrup moving through white styrofoam cups in Scotlandville, Louisiana, the cups that had become as routine as the gas station on the corner, as ambient as the slowed-down music on Tuesday nights, was not produced in a back room or a trailer or any of the spaces that the word narcotics tends to conjure. It was manufactured in a building with a parking lot and an employee handbook and a fire safety inspection certificate on the wall. The scale of production made local interdiction essentially irrelevant. Arresting source would not stop the supply. Arresting the 3 or 4 distributors above source would not stop it. The terminal nodes were replaceable by design. The manufacturing continued regardless of what happened at the street level. Dr. Okafor did not know any of this yet when she sent her ER director memo on Monday morning. But the toxicology told her enough. The product was consistent across samples, meaning it was produced at scale with quality control. The concentration ratios were engineered. This was not someone adding fentanyl to syrup in a bathtub. This was pharmaceutical-level production applied to an illegal product. The memo went to 7 ER medical directors across Louisiana. It went to 2 at hospitals in Mississippi. It went to the head of emergency medicine at Our Lady of the Lake Regional Medical Center in Baton Rouge, a man named Dr. Vincent Marchetti, 60 years old, who read it the following morning and forwarded it to his department leads with a single line of annotation asking for a protocol review meeting before the end of the month. The meeting was scheduled for July 8th. July 4th weekend arrived first. Marcus had been drinking Source's product for 3 months by then. His body had constructed its entire chemical baseline around it, not around codeine, which his system had initially adapted to, but around this analogue, this faster and more aggressive compound that had replaced codeine so gradually in his supply that the transition had no discrete moment. He didn't know the formula had changed. Nothing about the taste or colour had told him. The faster hit, the deeper sedation. He had attributed these to tolerance, to the cups getting stronger because his body needed more. His tolerance was real. His interpretation was wrong. What tolerance had actually done was push his daily dose higher, which pushed the total analog load in his bloodstream higher, which pushed him steadily toward the upper boundary of what his cardiovascular system could process without intervention. He was not approaching an overdose in the way that overdoses are usually imagined, a single reckless decision, one cup too many, an obvious excess. He was approaching it the way a person approaches the edge of a cliff in thick fog, by continuing to walk in the direction they have always walked, at the speed they have always walked, not knowing the ground is about to end. The 4th of July cookout at Loretta's house was not an escalation in his use. It was a normal day. That is the most important fact in this entire story. Marcus Webb did not drink more than usual on July 4th weekend. He drank his normal amount, the amount his body now required to function at baseline, the amount that had become indistinguishable from ordinary daily maintenance. On any given Tuesday in June, the same cups were in his hand. The cookout was not the cause. The cookout was just when the margin finally ran out. But here is what nobody would know until after the ambulance, after the ER, after the naloxone that paused rather than reversed, after Dr. Okafor received a page that would interrupt a presentation she'd spent 3 weeks preparing. The batch Source had received that week was a high-end batch. The variants that normally ran between 80 and 150 times morphine's potency had landed in that particular case of product at the upper register. Not the highest possible, that would come later, in other cups, in other hands. But high enough that Marcus's customary pour, the amount his body had normalized to, the amount that on a Tuesday in June produced a manageable high, was now carrying a load his heart had never encountered before. He didn't know that. Source didn't know that. Nobody at the cookout knew that. Loretta was in the kitchen making potato salad when Marcus arrived. The yard smelled like charcoal and cut grass and something sweet from the cooler someone had positioned near the back fence. Trey was sitting on the porch steps with his phone. Devon was already there, cup in hand, laughing at something someone had said on the other side of the yard. Marcus filled a plate. He filled his cup. He sat in a folding chair near the fence and let the afternoon move around him. It was 1:15 p.m. The afternoon moved the way Louisiana July afternoons move, slowly, heavily, the heat pressing down on everything with the patient weight of something that has been doing this for months and intends to continue. The yard filled gradually. Loretta's neighbours from both sides came through the gate. Devon's cousin Reginald arrived with a bag of ice. Someone connected a speaker to the fence post and the music competed with the sound of the grill and the specific layered noise of 20 people in a small yard, all talking at once, all at a volume calibrated to be heard over everyone else. Marcus ate. He refilled his cup once, then again. Not unusual for an afternoon cookout. Not for him, not for the people around him who had their own cups, their own drinks, their own way of managing a holiday in the heat. The cookout was not a place of abstinence and nobody expected it to be. The cups were ambient. They were furniture. He sat in his folding chair by the back fence and watched the yard with the particular stillness of someone whose interiority has been turned down. Not absent. He laughed at things. He raised his cup when someone across the yard caught his eye. He tracked the conversation near him with enough attention to nod at the right moments. He was present in every visible way. His heart was working harder than anyone could see. The fentanyl analog suppresses respiratory drive first. The brainstem's automatic command to breathe, which operates below conscious control, which a person cannot override by force of will the way they can hold their breath deliberately. When the suppression is mild, breathing slows and shallows without stopping. When it deepens, the CO2 levels in the blood begin to rise, and in a body not under chemical suppression, that rising CO2 triggers an urgent corrective response. A deep breath, a jolt of wakefulness. Under the analog's influence, that alarm is muted. The body continues receiving insufficient oxygen. The heart, compensating, begins to work against a circulation that is thickening with elevated CO2. The rate drops as the cardiac muscle strains against chemistry it was not designed to process. None of this is visible from across a yard on a Tuesday afternoon. None of it feels like emergency from the inside. It feels like the high deepening, which is what a high deepening feels like, which is what the drug always felt like, which is why the body has no alarm language for this particular crisis. At 3:31 p.m, Marcus stood up. He had been sitting for 2 hours. He stood with the specific deliberate quality of someone who has been very still for a long time and is compensating for it. Planting his feet wider than natural, putting one hand briefly on the back of the folding chair. Devon, 3 feet away, watched this without registering it as significant. Marcus steadied. He said something toward the grill. Someone was calling for plates, and he was going for more food. He took 4 steps toward the grill. He sat back down on the grass. Not a collapse, not a fall, a sitting down, the way a child sits, sudden and complete, like the decision to be on the ground was made and executed in the same instant, without the usual intermediate steps. Devon saw it. Devon called his name. Marcus's head was down, chin toward chest. The posture of someone looking at something in their lap, except there was nothing in his lap and his hands were open at his sides. Devon's hand on Marcus's shoulder found no response. None. The kind of non-response that is different from sleep. The body not yielding to touch, but simply not registering it, as if the connection between the physical world and the person inside it had been temporarily suspended. Devon shouted his name this time. Someone near the grill turned. Then someone else. The specific quality of Devon's voice, not volume, but frequency. A pitch that human hearing is tuned to recognize as different from ordinary noise, spread through the yard in under 4 seconds. The conversation stopped the way conversations stop when something shifts from social to real. Loretta came out of the kitchen door at the same moment someone else was already dialing. She moved across the yard faster than a 71-year-old woman with bad knees should have been able to move. She was on her knees beside Marcus before Devon had finished saying her name. Her hands went to his face, lifting his chin, and she saw the colour of his lips and made a sound that was not a word, not a name, just a sound, and it cut through everything else in that yard completely. The 911 call was made at 3:34 p.m. Trey had been on the porch steps with his phone when Marcus stood up. He saw it happen. He watched his brother walk 4 steps and then sit down on the grass, and for 3 full seconds he processed it as something routine. Marcus sitting, Marcus pausing, Marcus doing something Trey didn't understand. Then Devon called the name and Trey was on his feet and moving before the thought to move had fully formed. He stopped at the edge of the small crowd that had gathered because there was nowhere for him to go inside it. He was 17. His grandmother was on the ground. Devon was on the ground. There were adults doing the things that adults do in emergencies, and Trey was outside all of it, standing at the perimeter, watching his brother's chest for the movement that would tell him breathing was still happening. The chest was moving, very slowly, but moving. The EMS unit arrived at 3:41 p.m, 7 minutes from dispatch, which is a good response time for a residential street in North Baton Rouge on a holiday weekend. 2 paramedics moved through the gate with practiced efficiency, the way people move when urgency has been metabolized into procedure. The first assessment took 90 seconds. Pulse, present, 28 beats per minute. Respirations, 6 per minute against a normal rate of 12 to 20. Oxygen saturation, 74% against a normal rate above 95%. The presentation was opioid overdose, the constellation of signs too specific to be anything else. The first paramedic drew naloxone, 2 milligrams, intravenous, administered at 3:43 p.m. They watched the monitor. At 3:45 p.m. the heart rate began climbing. 28 became 31, 31 became 36. The oxygen saturation moved. 74 became 79, became 83. The breathing deepened slightly. Devon, standing 6 feet back with his hands clasped behind his head, exhaled audibly. Someone in the crowd said, "Thank God." The second paramedic was already radioing ahead to Our Lady of the Lake. Atypical opioid presentation. Partial initial response. Transporting now. Partial. That word. The first paramedic knew what partial meant in this context. He had been briefed 2 weeks earlier on a memo circulated by the hospital's emergency medicine department. A memo that had come from a researcher at LSU Health Sciences, forwarded by Dr. Marchetti, flagging an anomalous naloxone response pattern in lean-related overdoses in the North Baton Rouge corridor. He had read it in the break room, found it concerning, and filed it in the part of his professional memory reserved for things to watch for. He was watching for it now. At 3:49 p.m., 6 minutes after the first naloxone dose, Marcus's heart rate, which had climbed to 39, began moving in the wrong direction. 39 became 36. The oxygen saturation plateaued at 84 and held, then dipped to 81. The breathing, which had deepened briefly, returned to the shallow rhythm of before. The paramedic didn't wait for the full reversal to fail. He drew a second dose, 4 milligrams this time, double the first. Tree, watching from the yard gate as they loaded the stretcher into the ambulance, had Marcus's styrofoam cup in his hand. He didn't know how it had gotten there. Someone had handed it to him at some point in the chaos, some automatic gesture of clearing the area, and he had taken it without thinking, and now he was standing at the gate holding it. He looked at it. The purple liquid was still inside, half full. The grape Jolly Rancher dissolved into it, leaving that specific sweet smell that had been coming through Marcus's bedroom wall on Tuesday nights for the better part of a year. He set it on the curb, not threw it, set it, carefully, upright, as if it mattered whether it spilled. The ambulance doors closed. Devon stood in the middle of the yard with his hand over his mouth, watching the ambulance pull onto Scenic Highway. Loretta was still on the grass where Marcus had been, sitting now, Denise beside her with both arms around her. Denise, who had arrived from somewhere inside the house, at a moment nobody had clocked, who was now holding her mother and watching the street where the ambulance had been. 3 miles away, at LSU Health Sciences Center, Dr. Felicia Okafor was standing at the front of a small conference room, presenting her findings on the fentanyl analog to a group of 8 physicians and 2 pharmacists. She had been building to this presentation for 6 months. The slide on the screen behind her showed the binding affinity curve, the naloxone displacement window, the 7 to 12 minute rebinding timeline. Her pager went off at 3:51 p.m. She recognized the code. Our Lady of the Lake, Emergency Department. Atypical opioid presentation, incoming. She looked at the room. She told them she needed to leave and that she was sorry and that she would send the full presentation document by end of day. She picked up her bag. She was already moving toward the door when she said the last part. She ran to her car. She ran. The drive to the hospital was 11 minutes. She spent 8 of them on the phone with the ER charge nurse, getting the incoming presentation read back to her. Male, 24, lean suspected, partial naloxone response, second dose administered en route, heart rate 41 and climbing on the last radio update. 41 beats per minute, climbing. She parked in the emergency bay without a permit and walked through the ambulance entrance at 4:06 p.m., 6 minutes before the unit arrived. She identified herself to the triage nurse, explained her research connection to this specific presentation, asked to be present in the bay. The triage nurse made a call. Dr. Thureau, already aware that something atypical was incoming, authorized it. The ambulance backed in at 4:12 p.m. The doors opened. Thureau and Okafor were standing at the bay entrance when the stretcher came through. She saw Marcus Webb's lips, the grey-blue, the specific colour she'd been reading about in case files for 3 years, now in front of her, real, 24 years old, hands open at his sides. The monitor reading came through with the paramedic's handoff. Current heart rate, 28 beats per minute, second naloxone dose administered at 3:49 p.m, response plateau at 41, then secondary decline beginning at 4:04 p.m. Okafor heard that number, 4 minutes of secondary decline, and understood immediately. The rebinding window, 12 minutes from the second dose. They had 8 minutes left, possibly less, before the analogue fully reasserted. She spoke directly to Thureau. 4 sentences, fast, the binding curve, the rebinding window, the dose escalation required. Thureau looked at her for 2 seconds, not skepticism, assessment, and then turned to the nurse and gave the order. 8 milligrams of naloxone, intravenous, immediately. The largest single dose Thureau had ordered in 17 years of emergency medicine. The monitor above Bay 7 showed 28 beats per minute. Everyone in that room was watching a number that needed to move. The number moved. 28 became 33 at 4:19 p.m, 7 minutes after the 8 milligram dose. 33 became 38. The oxygen saturation, which had been sitting at 79, crossed 85 and kept going. Thureau watched the monitor with his arms at his sides. Not crossed this time. A different posture. The posture of someone who has done the thing and is now waiting to learn whether it was enough. Okafor stood at the foot of the bed with her hand on the bed rail, not gripping it, just resting there, as if she needed to be physically connected to something in the room. At 4:31 p.m, Marcus Webb's heart rate reached 52 beats per minute and stabilized. He did not regain full consciousness for another 4 hours. When he did, it was gradual, a surfacing, not a switch. His eyes opened part way, then closed. Opened again. The room resolved slowly, the overhead light and the monitor and the ceiling tiles and the IV line in his left arm, and the nurse checking his pressure, and, in the chair beside the bed, Loretta, still in the dress she'd been wearing at the cookout, one hand resting on the bed rail exactly where Okafor's had been, watching him with an expression that contained everything she had not said for 8 months. He was alive. The cardiac assessment conducted over the following 2 days told a more complicated story. The echocardiogram performed on July 6th showed structural changes to Marcus's left ventricle, a slight thickening of the wall, a reduction in ejection fraction from a normal range to 48%, a number that cardiologists classify at the lower boundary of mildly reduced. In practical terms, his heart was working. It would continue working. But it would work differently than it had on the morning of July 4th, and differently than it would have worked had none of this happened, and the medications required to support its new parameters were medications Marcus Webb, 24 years old, would take every day for the foreseeable future. The cardiologist who delivered this information was careful, precise, and did not use the word permanent until Marcus asked him directly. Then he used it. Denise sat in the corner of the room during that conversation. Trey stood in the doorway. Neither of them said anything while the cardiologist talked. After he left, the room held a silence that lasted nearly 2 full minutes, which is an extraordinarily long time for a hospital room with 4 people in it. Marcus looked at his hands on the blanket. They were still. Dr. Okafor spent the night of July 5th in the hospital, not attending Marcus but working at a terminal in the physician's lounge, assembling the full case documentation, Turode's ER notes, the paramedic handoff report, the toxicology drawer taken on admission, her own Houston lab results, into a formal case report that would become, when submitted to the CDC's Overdose Surveillance Division the following Monday, the first formally documented instance of the new fentanyl analogue in a lean-related overdose in the Gulf Coast region. The CDC field investigation team arrived in Baton Rouge on July 21st. 2 epidemiologists and a forensic toxicologist based out of the Atlanta office, operating on a 2-week field deployment. They interviewed Okafor for 6 hours on the first day. They requested confiscated samples from the Baton Rouge Police Department's evidence inventory. They visited Our Lady of the Lake and reviewed 7 cases from the previous 8 months that, in retrospect, showed the same partial naloxone response pattern that had characterized Marcus's overdose. 7 cases, 8 months, all documented, all filed, none flagged as a cluster until Okafor's report named them as one. The investigation was real. The response was real. It was also, by the most precise available measurement, 5 months late, the length of time between Okafor's January memo to the Louisiana Department of Health and the moment institutional machinery finally engaged at a speed proportionate to the problem. Devon Arsenault was not part of the CDC investigation, not as a subject, not as a witness. Devon was not asked to participate in anything, because Devon was managing his own cups, his own mornings, his own version of the dependency that had grown in parallel with Marcus's across the same months, from the same supply, through the same connect. Devon did not go to a hospital after Marcus's overdose. He did not stop drinking lean. He reduced it, or told himself he reduced it, which is a different thing, and he switched sources because Source had gone quiet in the weeks after July 4th, spooked by something in the atmosphere of the neighborhood that addicts and dealers both develop a sensitivity to. Devon found a new connect through a mutual, paid slightly more, received product that felt different. Lighter, he said, less intense. He took this as a positive sign. On a Saturday evening in late July, 3 weeks after Marcus came home from the hospital, Devon Arsenault was found unresponsive in his apartment by his upstairs neighbour, who had come down to return a borrowed phone charger and noticed Devon's door ajar and the television running, and Devon on the couch in the posture that was no longer the posture of sleep. He was 26 years old. The cause of death listed on the medical examiner's report was acute respiratory failure, secondary to fentanyl analog toxicity. The same compound, a different batch, different source, but traceable, through the CDC's subsequent analysis, to the same manufacturing operation that had supplied Source. The network was larger than one connect. The product was moving through multiple distribution channels simultaneously. Shutting down Source's specific line had redirected Devon to a different terminal node of the same root system. Marcus was told about Devon on a Sunday morning, 11 days after coming home from the hospital. Denise sat with him when he was told. He was in Loretta's kitchen, the same kitchen where the Jolly Ranchers had been moved and returned and moved again, the same table where Denise had sat in the dark at 11 p.m. to absorb the news about his job. He sat at that table for a long time after. He did not go to Devon's funeral. He was not yet stable enough to leave the house without supervision, on the advice of his cardiologist, and the family made the decision quietly that the stress of the service was a medical risk they were not going to take. Loretta went. She sat in the second row of Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church, the same church she attended every Sunday, and watched Devon's mother in the front row, and held Devon's mother's hand during the recessional. Trey went to the funeral. He wore Marcus's suit jacket because his own was too small across the shoulders. He sat beside Loretta and did not cry during the service, which people who noticed it attributed to teenage stoicism. the specific guardedness of a 17-year-old boy at a grief event. What it actually was something else. He was storing it. The same thing he did with every observation that mattered. Filing it somewhere deep where it would be accessible later, in whatever form later required it. Terence Lyle Mouton, source, was arrested on August 14, 2025. Not by the DEA, not by the Baton Rouge Narcotics Division, not in connection with the fentanyl analogue, not in connection with Devon Arsenault's death, not in connection with Marcus Webb's cardiac damage, or any of the other cases the CDC team was now documenting. He was arrested by the Louisiana Department of Revenue in coordination with the IRS on 6 counts of tax fraud and 1 count of failure to report cash income exceeding $200,000 across tax years 2022 through 2024. The arresting agents were accountants, not narcotics officers, accountants. The drug case, when it was eventually brought, was secondary, a consequence of the financial investigation rather than its origin. Mouton's attorney negotiated a plea on the drug charges that resulted in a sentence running concurrent with the tax fraud conviction. The total exposure was 4 years, with eligibility for parole after 20 months. The manufacturing operation that had supplied him was not named in the indictment. It was mentioned in the investigative file as a subject of ongoing federal inquiry. The Wyoming LLC was dissolved in September 2025, a routine administrative action, legally unremarkable, that extinguished the paper trail connecting Mouton's supply to its source. A new entity was registered in a different state within 6 weeks. The product kept moving. Marcus began a methadone maintenance program on August 3rd through the LSU Health Sciences Addiction Medicine Clinic, the same institution where Okafor worked, which is not a coincidence but a consequence of the fact that North Baton Rouge had limited addiction, medicine infrastructure, and the clinic was one of the few facilities offering medication-assisted treatment without a months-long waiting list. His enrollment was facilitated by a referral from Dr. Turode, who had reached out to the clinic directly rather than routing through the standard referral pathway, which would have taken longer. Methadone maintenance is not abstinence. It is management, the stabilization of opioid-dependent brain chemistry using a long-acting, orally administered opioid that eliminates withdrawal, eliminates craving, and allows a person to function. It requires daily clinic attendance for the first phase, which means Marcus was at the clinic on Airline Highway every morning at 7 a.m., including Saturdays for the first 6 weeks. He relapsed once, in October. Not lean. He had enough understanding of what lean had done to his heart to avoid it specifically. A different opioid, a single night, available at a gathering he shouldn't have attended at a point when his grief over Devon was at its least managed. He told his treatment counsellor the following morning, which is what the program asks its participants to do, and which most participants in the early stages of treatment cannot bring themselves to do. He told her. The program adjusted. He stayed. The shaking in his hands, which had been a feature of his morning since February, took 8 months from the start of the methadone program to fully resolve. Not because methadone is slow, it isn't, but because the neurological recalibration of a system that had spent more than a year rewired around a synthetic opioid is not a switch that flips. It is a gradual restoration, a slow relearning of what normal chemistry feels like, complicated by the grief of Devon and the guilt of the cardiac damage and the particular silence that had descended on the yellow house on Scenic Highway. Okafor's case report was published in the Journal of Emergency Medicine in February 2026. It was co-authored with Turode and Asante, carried a detailed methodology, and included the full reversal protocol recommendations for the specific analogue. Higher initial naloxone doses, mandatory redosing at 7 minutes regardless of apparent response, cardiac monitoring for a minimum of 48 hours post-reversal. The paper received 200 downloads in the first week, which is a respectable number for an emergency medicine journal, and a number that corresponds to perhaps 200 physicians who would now know what to do if a patient arrived in their bay with 28 beats per minute and grey-blue lips. 200. Against a distribution network that had been operating in at least 14 states. The paper was cited in a CDC advisory bulletin issued in March 2026. The bulletin recommended updated naloxone protocols for suspected lean overdoses in affected regions. The bulletin was distributed to state health departments. It entered the system that processes these things at the speed the system processes them. Doctor. Okafor printed the published paper and kept a copy on her desk. Not as a trophy. She was not a person who kept trophies. She kept it because she had learned, over the preceding year, that the distance between documented and addressed was longer than she had believed when she started her career, and the paper on her desk was a reminder to keep pushing across that distance, rather than assuming the publication was the end of something. It wasn't the end. Trey, in November 2025, applied early decision to LSU's School of Architecture. His portfolio included 12 original building designs, all hand-drafted, and a personal statement that didn't mention Marcus, did not mention Devon, did not mention Lean or Scotlandville, or the ambulance that had backed into the driveway on a July afternoon. The personal statement was about structure, about why buildings stand, about what it means to design something intended to outlast the people who built it. His counselor called it one of the strongest personal statements she had read in 11 years. He was accepted in December. Marcus found out the same day Trey got the acceptance letter. He was in the kitchen when Trey came in holding his phone with the email on the screen, and Marcus looked at the phone and then looked at Trey, and then he pulled his brother into a hug that lasted longer than either of them expected, neither of them moving to end it. The kitchen quiet around them, except for the sound of the refrigerator, and, outside, the particular late December light of a Louisiana afternoon going gold through the window above the sink. Loretta's tomatoes were dead in the side yard. She would plant new ones in March. Something in Trey had gone very quiet since July. Not sullen. Trey had never been sullen. It wasn't his register. Quiet in a specific way. Watchful. Deliberate. As if he was moving through the world with a precision he hadn't had before, setting each foot down carefully, measuring every step against something only he could see. He had stopped spending Friday nights at other people's houses. He came home directly from school, he drew his floor plans at the kitchen table, and he watched Marcus, and he watched Loretta, and he watched the refrigerator list with its handwritten priorities, and said nothing about any of it. What was in him, and where it would go, was not yet visible. That was the thing that kept Loretta watching him, the same way she had watched Marcus, quietly, from the kitchen, with the patience of someone who knew that what happens to the oldest child in a family always echoes into the youngest. The question was what the echo would sound like. The nurse who wheeled Marcus Webb into Bay 7 remembered the smell first. She would think about that detail for months afterward. Not the monitor reading, not the colour of his lips, not the sound of the room shifting into emergency register. The smell. Grape candy dissolved in something that had no business being sweet, rising off his clothes and his skin and the creases of his hands. She had smelled it before, she'd said afterward, just not that strong. What she didn't know, standing in that bay on a Tuesday afternoon in July with the monitor reading 28 beats per minute, was that the strength of the smell was the least unusual thing about what was happening to Marcus Webb's body. She didn't know about the rebinding window. Nobody in that room did. Not yet. Not until the woman who ran through the ambulance entrance at 4:06 p.m. got to the foot of the bed and started talking. Now the viewer knows everything the nurse didn't. The cup that almost killed Marcus Webb was not an anomaly in his life. It was a Tuesday. The amount he drank that Saturday afternoon was his normal amount. The quantity his body had reorganized itself around over 13 months of use. The quantity that had been survivable on every preceding occasion, because every preceding batch had landed somewhere in the lower register of the variance range. The high-end batch was not exceptional in any way that Marcus or anyone at that cookout could have detected. Same colour, same smell, same grape Jolly Rancher dissolving in the same way at the bottom of the same white styrofoam cup. The only difference was a number nobody knew to measure. Dr. Felicia Okafor's paper was published in February 2026 in the Journal of Emergency Medicine and downloaded 200 times in the first week. 200 physicians now carry the knowledge of the rebinding window, the escalated naloxone protocol, the specific cardiac monitoring requirements for this analogue. That number, 200, should be held next to another number, 14. 14 states where the CDC's subsequent field investigation found evidence of the same manufacturing operations product in the lean supply chain. 14 states, each with their own emergency rooms, their own paramedics, their own standard protocols calibrated for a drug that is no longer what it used to be. The paper is real. The gap between the paper and the protocol change in 14 states is also real, and it is measured not in science but in administration, in the speed of advisory bulletins, in the quarterly meeting schedules of substance use disorder committees, in the distance between a published finding and the moment a paramedic in a city the researcher has never visited draws a different dose because someone updated the laminated card in the kit. That distance has a body count. It is not yet final. The Wyoming LLC that served as the legal architecture for the manufacturing operation was dissolved in September 2025. A new entity was registered in South Dakota 6 weeks later. South Dakota's LLC registration requirements are comparable to Wyoming's. The registration fee is $150. The listed business purpose of the new entity is health and wellness product distribution. The product line has not changed. Terrence Mouton is in a federal correctional facility in Pollock, Louisiana, 60 miles northwest of the neighborhood where he sourced and sold the product that killed Devon Arsenault and damaged Marcus Webb's left ventricle permanently. His parole eligibility date falls in March 2027. The manufacturing operation he unknowingly served as a terminal node for generated an estimated $4.2 million in revenue in 2024 alone, according to the financial forensics attached to a sealed federal investigation whose existence was confirmed in a court filing in January 2026 and whose resolution date remains listed as pending. Pending. That word doing the same quiet devastation as partial, doing it in a different room. Marcus Webb, 24 years old, sits on Loretta's back porch on a Saturday morning in March 2026. The tomatoes she planted 2 weeks ago are in the ground, small, uncertain, the same optimistic project they have always been in a climate that makes them work for every inch. He has a mug of coffee, not a cup. The distinction is not symbolic to him. He simply drinks coffee in the morning now, because mornings are different, because the first hour of the day no longer has a chemical deficit waiting to be corrected. His hands are still, not obviously, visibly still, not in the way that stillness becomes remarkable after years of tremor, just still the way hands are still when a body is at rest, and nothing in the body's chemistry is requesting urgency. He wraps both hands around the mug because the March morning has a coolness to it, the particular edge of a Louisiana late winter that arrives without announcement and is gone by 10 a.m. Trey comes out the back door at 8:15 and sits on the step below Marcus without saying anything. He has his phone, but he's not looking at it. He accepted his architecture offer in January. He starts in August. He's been measuring rooms, literally with a tape measure he found in Marcus's old toolbox, and sketching floor plans of spaces he knows, including Loretta's house, including the dimensions of every room, the window placements, the load-bearing walls. He sketched the back porch last week. Then he sketched it again differently, with a wider overhang, better shade. The two of them sit in the morning quiet for a long time. The street is still. The gas station 2 blocks over is already open, the sign lit, the door propped, the rack near the register carrying its inventory without awareness of what any of it means in the specific context of this specific neighborhood. The styrofoam cups are on the rack, 2 for $1. The Jolly Ranchers are in a jar beside them. The world does not rearrange itself around individual damage. Marcus takes a sip of coffee. He looks at the tomatoes. He looks at the side yard fence where Devon used to lean during cookouts, 1 foot up on the lowest rail, talking to whoever was nearby with the specific ease of someone who believed every room he entered was improved by his presence. He was not wrong about that. He's been gone 8 months. The grief of Devon sits in Marcus differently than grief is usually described, not as weight, not as absence, but as a kind of permanent alteration of perception, the way vision changes permanently after looking at something too bright. Things look different now, not worse, necessarily. Different. Edges he didn't used to notice. The space between things. He drinks his coffee. Trey is drawing something on the back of an envelope he's pulled from his pocket. A small sketch, fast lines, the habit of a person for whom drawing is thinking. Marcus doesn't ask what it is. It's a building. It's always a building now with tree, structures holding up under their own logic, walls meant to last. Here is what is true as of March 2026. There is no federal early warning system for fentanyl analogues in counterfeit lean. Not an absence of effort. There are monitoring programs, surveillance initiatives, the CDC's overdose data network, the DEA's Synthetic Drug Intelligence Unit. But the specific gap that allowed this analogue to enter the Gulf Coast lean supply, circulate for over 18 months, kill people, and damage hearts across 14 states, and be identified only through the independent, unfunded, bureaucratically discouraged work of one researcher. That gap has not been structurally closed. The monitoring systems that exist were built for the last crisis, updated incrementally for the current one, and will require another cycle of damage before they fully incorporate the next variation. The variation is already in development somewhere. This is not speculation. Every previous synthetic opioid crisis has followed the same pattern. Identification, scheduling, reformulation by manufacturers who stay one molecular modification ahead of the legal definition, re-entry into the supply chain under a new name or no name at all. Dr. Okafor is currently preparing a second paper. This one is not about the specific analogue. It is about the surveillance gap, the structural distance between a researcher with data and a first responder with a protocol, and what lives in that distance while the system processes. She's also simultaneously advising 3 harm reduction organizations across Louisiana on fentanyl test strip distribution programs specifically targeted at the lean-using population, a demographic that the test strip infrastructure had not previously prioritized because the lean-using population had not previously been understood to need it. They need it. They needed it 18 months ago. The styrofoam cups are still 2 for $1 at the gas station on Scenic Highway. The streetlight on the corner of Scenic and East Brookstown, 40 yards from where Devon Arsenault was shot in June 2024. The event that sent Marcus to a backyard gathering 11 days later, that put the first cup in his hand, that started the sequence whose endpoint was Bay 7 and 28 beats per minute. That streetlight was repaired in January 2026, 7 months after Marcus's overdose, 19 months after it first went dark. It works now. It lights the corner. Somewhere in America tonight. Not metaphorically, not approximately, but specifically, in a city with a name, in a neighborhood with a gas station that sells styrofoam cups, at a gathering where the music is slowed down and the heat is bearable, and someone has a connect who is reliable, and the price is right. Someone is pouring purple liquid into a white cup. They're adding a grape Jolly Rancher. They're watching it dissolve. They're thinking about the week behind them, the specific weight of it, the particular variety of exhaustion that this particular year, in this particular life has produced. They are not thinking about molecular binding profiles. They are not thinking about ejection fractions or rebinding windows, or the manufacturing facility in a commercial district in a city they've never been to. They are thinking about the quiet that is about to arrive, the loosening, the world going to 3/4 time. They pick up the cup. On Loretta's back porch, Marcus finishes his coffee. He sets the mug down. He looks at his hands for a moment, not checking them, not monitoring them, just the ordinary glance a person gives their own hands when they've been holding something warm and set it down. Still. Always a question left. Always one. Trey folds the envelope sketch and puts it back in his pocket. He looks out the yard, at the young tomato plants that aren't yet much to look at the fence, at the specific quality of a Louisiana Saturday morning that has not yet decided what kind of day it will become. He's 17 years old. He has seen what he's seen. He's about to go study architecture in a city that will ask him, in 4 years, to design something meant to stand. What he builds with what he carries, that part is still being written.